must say I've enjoyed today very much indeed. I guess I'm used to being around academic crowds, academic audiences, which of course tend to be much more focused on diagnosis, explanation, and all too often rather light on thinking about practical implications and practical proposals. And so in that respect, it's been very refreshing to be part of this discussion today. I'm going to step back a little bit from the immediacy of Brexit and the questions which have been filling the airwaves in the last couple of years to talk a little bit more generally about Europe and Britain, let's say beyond Brexit, around Brexit, but of course touching on some of those aspects as well. I'm going to start a bit with diagnosis. I am an academic after all, so I will start with trying to scene set a little bit, but then try and come on to some more practical questions that might affect Labour today. I mean, how could one not start by saying something about Italy, of course, in this particular week? I think one of the striking things about Italy and the Italian elections recently is just the extent to which it reveals the decline of established parties and the sudden appearance of new electoral formations that have achieved a great deal of support very, very quickly. Movimento 5 Stelle and of course the Lega, which is a longer standing institution but has evolved rather quickly. Those are forces that have, in the case of the Movimento, 32% in the election. In the case of the Lega, 18%. The Democratic Party, of course, a longer-standing leftist party, is down on 20%. So you see there a shift in the balance of power in Italy, which, of course, not just in Italy, but emblematically in this particular place, where established parties have declined, of the left especially, and great volatility brings new parties to the fore. Now, of course, we are all entirely familiar with the kind of commonsensical diagnosis that tends to be given to this phenomenon, generally speaking, with some notion of populism as the account given. That's some kind of mix of grievances economic, especially in southern Europe, grievances cultural, especially in northern and western Europe. Italy perhaps is an interesting mix of the two, where the Lega is, of course, making a very xenophobic party message. The Movimento 5 Stelle is something that mixes economic grievances and cultural grievances. But in some kind of balance, one is seeing a set of populist parties across Europe, and most foremost at the moment in Italy, arriving on the back of these kind of grievances, broadly wrapped with a concept of populism. Now, it seems to me that the populism diagnosis that we are all very familiar with, not least from the mainstream media, I think is problematic in a number of ways. In its cultural strand, in which it says that a lot of support for contemporary parties is based on grievances of some cultural kind, I think it's problematic insofar as it very easily tends towards writing off a lot of people as xenophobic, as instinctively racist. Which is not to say that these parties are not campaigning on exactly those positions. I think one can very well say that the Lega is making policy proposals which are entirely hostile to those considered to be somehow not authentically Italian. But to understand their support as necessarily deriving only from these type of, let's call them cultural grievances, I think is problematic. So imputing xenophobia more widely than perhaps one wants to is one of the problems of this macro kind of populism diagnosis that we're familiar with. Another one, of course, is that a lot of these movements draw cross-class support. In other words, they're not simply to be understood as some type of parties riding on economic grievances. They draw support from different classes in many countries, and that's certainly true in Italy as well. And third, and I think perhaps this is the point that I want to emphasize, when we adopt this familiar way of thinking about new parties as being inspired either by economic grievance or cultural grievance, what we're missing is there's a political core, I think, to a lot of these campaigns, which is exactly not just about denouncing what we might call policy failure, in other words, unemployment. Clearly these things come into the mix, but it's not just about saying established parties have failed on policy, nor just presenting them somehow detached elites, although that again is part of the the claims being made, but it's a critique, I think, very specifically of acquiescence before political circumstances, before circumstances of socioeconomic forces, also of cultural conditions. And these new parties, like Movimento Cinque Stelle and the Lega, are often, I think, coming to support on the back of a message which says, away with those who have been too quick to acquiesce in the circumstances in which they find themselves. What does that mean exactly? Well, tapping a desire in some way for parties that do not what they claim has to be done, not a politics of necessity, but a politics of some kind of volition, of doing what one wants to do rather than doing what one has to do. If there's anything in common, I think, between a wide variety of movements that get this name populism in contemporary discourse, I think it's generally not to do with their economic position or their cultural politics position, but it's that they are very often a critique of other parties that have somehow disavowed their agency, have said that what they're going to do in policy-making terms is basically adaptation to necessity. Of course, we're familiar with this as a kind of neoliberal discourse, a third-way discourse of accommodation to market realities. I think it's all ramped up further in the context of the crisis years of Europe of the last 10 years or so. What is crisis politics all about? It's exactly about doing things that have to be done and making your claims for policy on the basis of necessity, not on the basis that there are a certain set of values that you want to defend and promote with the policies in question. So crisis politics is about a kind of amplification of this longer-term neoliberal disavowal of agency, which is, I think, easily associated with many parties of the left as well as of the centre. So populism, I don't like the term very much. I think it points to the wrong things. It points towards anti-elite discourse, towards references to the people, to certain type of claims which I think, although they're present in a lot of contemporary political movements, they're not perhaps the motivational force of those parties in question. I think a lot of the motivational support for parties across contemporary Europe, which are new parties, which are capitalizing on the decline of existing social democratic parties of the left, the motivational force of their message is often not purely about policy failure of an economic kind, not purely about the kind of cultural grievances that something like the Lega is articulating, but a critique of parties that acquiesce in out-of-control forces, that do what they do in the name of necessity rather than volition, because they want to do something. It's a sort of reassertion, if you like, of the primacy of politics that can take the form of emphasizing sovereignty, and some of this clearly comes out in Brexit discourse, invocations of the will of the people, of taking back control, which I think is clearly one of the dominant strands of contemporary British politics. It's about exactly emphasizing what politics should be as something that transcends socioeconomic necessity. Incidentally, I think it's not always about popular will. The Trumps, the Johnsons of this world, I think they're also, if you like, performing a kind of politics of anti-necessity, but not necessarily because they have always a clear political argument to advance, a clear political critique, but almost at the level of personalized politics. They present themselves as those who are no one's pulling their strings. No one is they're their own master. They are doing what they want to do rather than what they have to do. I think Trump's politics can very much be read as even, it's not just about claims to rein in the power of the WTO or of other types of international treaties, but very much about performing this idea that I am someone that acts on volition rather than of necessity. And I think that's true of many contemporary European parties emerging very quickly on the left and the right. So, what does one get from seeing it this way? Well, clearly, this type of anti-necessitarian politics can take many different forms, and we see it taking forms of both left and right at present across Europe. Clearly, one can read formations like Podemos in Spain, I think, as also adopting this type of politics of volition rather than necessity, but in a very different way. And this is where sometimes the term populism is exactly very problematic, because it elides very different currents, political currents. But if there's anything in common, it is, as I said, this type of anti-necessitarian politics. If one reads the support for such parties as with this kind of inspiration, then there may be more support for leftist positions out there than would currently be suggested by the rise of parties like the Lega and the Movimento Cinque Stelle in Italy. What is also implied clearly is that we can expect more rapid turnover of parties, organizational turnover. Italy, as I said, is, if you like, writ large, a larger pattern across Europe of fading long-term parties. Labour in Britain, of course, is quite against the trend in this respect, and the emergence of parties that have very little history behind them emerging out of nowhere. And this kind of rapid turnover, I think, is quite a challenge for transnationalism, for making links between like-minded parties in different countries. Cooperation of a transnational kind takes time. It takes some type of familiarity with other party systems, and precisely what becomes more difficult in this period of political volatility is to find, if you like, parties of transnationalism, partners in other countries that can take forward some kind of common cause transnationally. And, of course, what this current period of great volatility also suggests is that the venues of cooperation of transnationalism are increasingly uncertain. Socialist internationals are not really a particularly live phenomenon at present. Of course, there is a socialist international. It does do work, but a lot of the parties that form it, we might say, are socialist in name only, and this would be exactly the critique of many of these new parties. And the new parties that are doing increasingly well in European electoral politics are often not associated with these established vehicles of transnational cooperation at present. And of course, as Britain leaves the EU, then other potential arenas of coordination also become less immediately available. Okay, so those, it seems to me, are some of the challenges for a Labour-led government after Brexit, is to find ways of pursuing some type of transnationalist politics outside the EU, possibly to some degree through the EU as well, but in conditions in which potential partners are very hard to predict over time, emerge very quickly, recede very quickly, think of Syriza as well, and in arenas which are not well adapted to this type of organizational turnover. The conventional internationals of the left, I think, required or presupposed some degree of organizational continuity across time. And I think this is still an ideal for many on the left today, and probably should be, certainly is in this country. But that type of organizational continuity at the party level is exactly what seems to be in question in many European countries today. Are there any potential common causes that one can imagine such an internationalism of the left in Europe after Brexit to organize around? Well, I think there certainly are. Clearly, things like tax havens would be one that would come to mind fairly quickly. This is, of course, a point of transnational coordination within the European Union, but it tends to have been of great limited success in EU channels recently. Some of you will be perhaps familiar with the efforts to create a blacklist of countries around the world. Some would like it also to include EU countries which are understood to be tax havens and against which some type of sanctions could possibly be pursued, or at least one could waive the reputational threat of being on a blacklist and perhaps moving to a grey list with the right type of policy changes over time. This is, I think, it's a common cause that is out there, is established. It's very limited success so far. European socialist parties in the European Parliament did in the autumn try to push for some type of common European policy against tax havens around the world. This policy has been progressively watered down since November, when it was, I think there were initially 19 countries or something around the world. Incidentally, none of them within the EU, so the initial push had been to include 4 European countries, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, within and the Netherlands within that list, but that didn't really get very far. And then of those 19 around the world, which were subsequently drawn up, this has been eroded over time, I think down to 9. I think now it's down to 6, and it still needs unanimity on the Council of the EU to agree to even that blacklist of 6 countries. So on the one hand, what you have is some type of common cause, which I think is relevant to countries and parties of the left, whether they are inside the EU or whether they are outside the EU. I think a Labour-led government really should be trying to push for some type of policy on tax havens globally, and there is already some degree of coordination on this issue, but it's a highly imperfect and is to some degree limited by the institutional structures of the EU that make it very difficult to push such a policy when unanimity on a council is the condition of advancing it. So clearly there are those kind of common causes which are out there, and I think that Labour would need some type of position on. There are, of course, the issues all to do with the structure of the European Union itself, including its economic structure, Eurozone issues, but also perhaps more easily identified and acted upon political aspects. I've just been talking about tax havens. One of the problems with this type of cause as a transnational one is that no one really knows the decision-making processes that go into drawing up such a blacklist within the EU, and the process of negotiation is entirely opaque. This lack of transparency on that particular issue is, of course, characteristic of many other issues to do with the EU. Council decision-making, of course, is largely behind closed doors. So it seems to me, as a condition of other more substantive political agendas, this type of procedural agenda of making or putting pressure for negotiation processes which are within the European Union to be accessible to a broader public, to be visible, is something which needs to be there. That's also something that is achievable in some sense. Of course, the resistance against it is likely to be massive, but it's achievable in a very immediate term, and I think it would have a lot of knock-on effects for the kind of substantive causes that one might want to pursue transnationally with EU countries as well as beyond EU countries after Brexit. And I think there are also many other questions to do with the structure of the EU and its proceduralization that are relevant also to a leftist government outside the European Union. I think one of the great problems of the EU at present is not just the strictures of particular economic policies, although we've seen with Italy in the last week that that's very essential, especially for Eurozone members, but even beyond the Eurozone, and even if one were to somehow factor in a breakup of the Eurozone into the years ahead, one of the great structural challenges of the European Union, it seems to me, is that a huge amount of what it does bears very little resemblance to the formal understanding that one might have of how EU institutions work and the expected division of powers between them. There is a kind of a formal structure and an informal working pattern, and they have very little in common with each other and become increasingly detached from each other at crisis moments. I think this is, when you're inside the EU, this is clearly a big issue on democratic grounds. If you have absolutely no confidence in the procedural structure of how the union is meant to work, then how can you possibly impute responsibility? How can you be confident of the capacity to influence? But it's also, I think, a problem outside the European Union. It's not just a problem that one leaves behind with Brexit, because it's a weapon of power used against those who are outside the European Union. Exactly the opaqueness, the ambiguity of the procedural structures of the EU is something that is relevant to Brexit negotiations, is something which is used as, I think, is weaponized as a way of conducting the Brexit negotiations and presumably with any type of post-Brexit relations with Britain thereafter. So I mentioned three, if you like, substantive common causes that one might think a European transnationalism should be about in the present, some to do with economic issues, partly already established causes like to do with tax havens, some to do with the transparency, how do we even know how policies on these kind of things are put together, and a larger question to do with the structure of the EU, and does the EU on paper, if you like, bear any resemblance to the EU in practice. It seems to me that these are all common causes which speak to the diagnostic part of the what I was saying 10 minutes ago about the need, the motivational support that can be achieved by presenting oneself as a political force that does not respond simply to necessity, that tries to rebuild some notion of political agency. I think this is at least as important as good economic policies, at least as good as trying to change the structure of the Eurozone, of loosening the constraints of budgetary powers on Eurozone members. I think at least as important as this is actually reconstructing some notion of political parties as being emblems of the primacy of politics over socioeconomic forces. And I think that is something which, at least in terms of the framing in politics, is based on the success of populist parties across Europe, is something which has got a lot of power to it, and something that I think also Labour's success last year in this election was partly to be credited to, presenting itself as a party that does what it wants to do, that puts forward an agenda which is not someone else's agenda, but which is the agenda that it wants to stand for, rather than presenting itself as, if you like, the handmaiden of necessity. And I think this is perhaps the major break between old social democratic parties that are on the wane in the present and those that potentially still have a future. And that is something which any type of transnationalism, I think, needs to exactly reproduce, the effort to create some type of transnational political orientation which is equally defined by its politics of volition rather than simply of adaptation, of necessity, and so on. Yeah, maybe I'll stop at this point.